Thanks so much for staying until the very end. So early this morning, I talked about the VR comfort stack, which is more like a way to think about the system, and hopefully we can integrate it with Diego's ideas at some point. Here, I'd like to focus more on the practical side. So, what can we actually learn from people who will have a lot of virtual reality experience? So, this is a project from Alan's master's thesis. Bernhard and others were also involved in that. So, why are we here? I mean, you know the problem. These always these wonderful ideas of the things you might be able to do in virtual reality that are impossible to do in the real world, but the reality looks like this is not happening because of motion sickness. So, what's your own experience in motion sickness? Who ever got seriously sick in virtual reality? Who has kind of specific strategies or behaviors that you start applying once you start getting sick in VR? Quite a few. So what I'd like to do in this talk is really leverage and go into these individual ideas, and we specifically looked at people who have a lot of experience in there. So we know a lot of these different factors and mitigation strategies, but there's much less known about what people really do in reality. And most of these studies are done in simulations in the lab, in driving flight simulators and so on. So we felt like maybe there's a little bit of a translational gap between these more controlled findings and real world practice. So how do experienced VR users actually manage cybersickness? So we looked at three communities: researchers, content creators and developers, and also experienced gamers. And the central question was really, okay, what matters most for them in terms of the actual lived practice, and could this be something we might be able to integrate into our models or future studies and experiments? So we had quite some diversity. We interviewed 149 experienced VR users, researchers. Most of them had more than 200 VR experiences, so I feel like there's quite some knowledge accumulated in there. For 17 of them, we completed in-depth interviews as well, basically until we reached saturation for this. So we compared survey ratings with qualitative interviews and focused specifically on the perceived human experiential factors and also their strategies. So we ask a lot of different questions in there, and here I sort them basically by how relevant or how strongly our participants rated them to affect cybersickness. And these were of course based on the literature, your papers, and also a lot of pilot studies. So we also distinguished here, just in a simply in color, between human factors and internal factors. And clearly being familiar with VR, overall feeling of comfortable and so on, were really rated as highly influential, as are good airflow, audio, tactile cues corresponding and so on. And there's also a few cues that were rated as negatively affecting it, like having a hangover, headache, being in a stuffy room, having eaten too much, not enough, and so on the other side. So just really nice in confirming how important the user state actually is and how much the environment matters and the correspondence between the different cues. So did people really different? So we had these three different expert groups. And what we see is basically a relatively similar pattern. So we kind of same sorting. The only difference is that somehow for the gamers, it wasn't quite, stress level wasn't quite important, maybe because they actually game for fun, not for work, most of them. So then we asked also about the factors affecting cybersickness. And in the interviews, I don't have time to go into all the data, but a lot of them also really reiterated the importance of adaptation, habituation, familiarity, so really knowing what to do and so on. Same with the locomotion method, so there's huge training effects basically. So you get really good at knowing what to do when this happens. In the VR comfort stack model, well, this is of course the top level and affecting what you do. But also, there was clearly quite some diverse experiences. So some people habituated, so cybersickness improved over extensive uses. For others, it actually increased, so they got more sensitive over time. So quite some diversity in there. And then, of course, content, the type of games and so on, the duration, all of these were rated as highly relevant, as well as your overall physical condition, mental condition, factors like stress and so on, were reiterated in the interviews. And there's of course a lot more data in there. So what did they rate as most effective cybersickness mitigation strategy? So first we came up with a long list and we expanded and iterated and piloted and so on. So, and most of them are really not super surprising. So we know this, but it's interesting how important they rate them. So really taking breaks, managing the exposure was rated as the most important one. But of course also things like smoothing the movements, avoiding these harsh acceleration, this conflict, especially when it comes to reducing the rotational conflict, also improving airflow and grounding, and so on. And also a lot was about user agency. So they really wanted to select and be able to decide what to do where and wanted to have the good options. So in the VR comfort stack, so this is really, okay, they want control over level 3 and 4 in there. And the interviews largely corroborate this. So also many of them mentioned like taking a break, the physical movement and so on, adjusting locomotion methods and all these kind of things was really nicely supported in there. Again, did the strategies really differ between the groups? Well, a little bit more, not substantially, but there's a few different aspects where they differed a little bit. I don't think I need to go into detail. It's relatively small, so there was nothing that was completely conflicting. It was more the amount that changed. So basically the role and context shapes a little bit their comfort practice. Also, they do slightly different tasks, of course, depending on the expert group. Now, one question is, of course, okay, did we find anything that we don't know already? And if you look into detail, there's a lot of little things in there that are interesting. Mostly they didn't suggest really fancy or exotic technological solutions. It was mostly a lot about really, okay, how do you actually stay oriented? How do you stay grounded? How do you prepare? How do you stay in control? What do you do in that moment when you start noticing? They also talked about how do they actually notice that they start getting sick? And getting better at that was really rated as important. There was a lot about grounding and orientation support. So some people had interesting ways to use pass-through or reality blending. Some suggested having a rug underneath so you could actually feel the floor differently. So more tactile grounding, agency, gradual adaptation. So basically having options to switch on, being able to tune them. There's also a lot about onboarding, tutorialization, gradual ramp up before that. So really about framing, set and setting, all of this. Again, that would be the layer 1 in the VR comfort stack. And also about stable anchors, richer correspondence. We talked about reference frames and so on. And some people even mentioned like the sound of footsteps or the head bobbing, things like that. Multiple correspondence can really be useful for them. And of course, these were individual observations. So this is not a statistical significance. This points more to things that might be useful to further include or investigate, or to see like, oh, okay, could we integrate this? And yeah, so basically it suggests like, okay, what could we be looking at? By the way, I'm happy to share the slides later on if anybody wants them. In the thesis, we have a lot more. So we literally looked at all the different guidelines from the literature, basically, and then for each one, we looked into, okay, what categories, what do we have from our study, what does it relate to existing guidelines, how could we integrate this into new ones, basically, and come up with improved guidelines. And this was also part of the basis that we actually used for the VR comfort stack. Now, so what does it really mean then for our models and so on? Where could we use them? This is where I could also try and relate it to the VR comfort stack. So a lot of the models really focus a lot on the things you can easily measure. This is often lower level stimulus properties, bottom up aspects, and these are really important, absolutely. I'm not questioning this at all. But I think there's probably a bit more. And so there's a few different areas, and often across these different layers that really were interesting, like the preparation, the state before exposure. Down here, for example, stress and task framing, user agency really in terms of selecting different locomotion methods or adapting the field of view reduction system, for example. And then also the whole context, the onboarding, the expectation priming, airflow, all these kind of things that we often know that are important, but we sometimes forget in the study or don't give the user agency. Or as a provider or researcher, experimental, we don't really take enough control if we really want to make sure people are safe and we really want to reduce the chance of motion sickness. So, put differently, I think comfort is obviously a factor of the display properties, the technical properties, but I think it's a lot more than just that. It's really property of the whole system, how it is staged, how it is entered, managed, exited, the whole framework, the mindset, energy setting, and so on. So this doesn't replace mechanistic models, but I think we might want to include them more and more explicitly acknowledge them. And that's my hope here, is basically to really have a more comprehensive view of integrating them and with the actual practice integrated into our benchmark, into our models and frameworks, and have more discussion and more different ways to think about it. That's it. Thanks so much.